So this is Miss Holden again, and today I'm going to be talking about what you're going to be doing for today's lesson. So today's lesson is going to be looking at all the pictures that go along with this particular era during the Progressive Era. And at the conclusion of this presentation, you're going to be answering in an essential question in a paragraph, why was reform necessary in the earliest 20th century? And we're going to be looking at pictures that are going to help you to answer that question. Now, at the end of the presentation, you're going to be answering this question in a paragraph. My expectation of a paragraph, as you know, is 5 to 7 sentences. Yes, you need to write out your full paragraph. Along with that, as you go back and look at the pictures, you are going to then create hashtags for each of the images that we're going to examine for today. So let's go ahead and get started with our first picture. This here is a picture, and we're going to be looking at child labor during the early 18th century. So within this here, you'll notice that, for instance, this child is not wearing shoes, so that probably means that they were very poor. You'll also notice that their clothing is ripped. Now, it's not until much later on in our nation's history that there are child labor laws that are passed, but it was completely normal during this time period for children to work to be able to help support their families. Schooling was not mandatory, so if a child's family was poor, it was often the case where the children would be sent off to help to get income for that family that they were needing to help out. And that was okay. There were no laws like we know nowadays. There are laws on how early you can work. Generally, it's depending on what you do between the ages of 14 and 16. But during this time period, during the Progressive Era, young children, we're talking 5, 6, pretty much as young as that, could be sent to work into the factories to be doing menial tasks that could help to bring money into their families. So this particular person is working, maybe it looks like in some sort of looming industry, perhaps making clothing or cloth of some sort. All right, this here would be a picture of what it may look like within the South. Remember, we've talked about in the South that it was agriculturally based. These here are tobacco leaves, and it looks like the children here are plucking the tobacco leaves that then would be dried out in order to then turn it into tobacco. So within the North, they were generally working in factories, remember, but in the South, there was still plenty of child labor going on. And in this particular picture, you can see that through the use of farming tobacco. All right, the next group that we're going to talk about are people called muckrakers. Muckrakers are investigative journalists, and what their job was to try to bring knowledge to those bad things that they thought were happening during and in society. So we're going to be looking at these muckrakers who go into several different areas, and what their goal is to try to figure out what they can do to bring awareness to the bad things that were happening in the United States during this time. One of the sayings that you will have heard probably is the pen is sometimes mightier than the sword. So we have this idea that by them writing and by them writing articles and books and taking pictures, that will lead people to bring more awareness to the topic. All right, this here is a picture. This is within a Chicago meat packing plant. So some of the things that once you take a look at, you'll notice it looks like up here there is meat of some sort that is hanging. Down here, it looks like there's also a piece of meat. You'll notice that the men they're all wearing like butchers' aprons. Now, one of the things you should notice, though, is that it looks kind of dirty, right? And they're cutting up this animal on the floor. This has to do with a guy that we're going to talk about here called Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair is one of those muckrakers that we just talked about that wanted to bring awareness to the meat packing industry. So he goes into the Chicago meat packing industry and he gets a job. He goes undercover, basically. And he discovers that The conditions were nasty, disgusting, horrible. He writes about instances where there were rats that would be ground up and sent into meat that would then go to the supermarket. He writes about a time that he saw a coworker, his arm ground up, and they didn't like necessarily pull out the ground up arm that went through the grinder, so it went into the meat that was then sold in the supermarkets. He talked about how they would take spoiled meat and add coloring and extra blood to it to make it look like it wasn't spoiled, but then go ahead and sell it anyway. And this is one example of it. Now, what he does is he writes about it in a book called The Jungle. And within The Jungle, he writes about all the awful things that he sees within the Chicago meatpacking industry. And women in particular take a wide interest in this because they are the ones, remember, that are generally cooking for their families. And they couldn't believe that they were serving this stuff to their families. So they started to, women in particular, started to protest and to ask for things to be done for changes to be made to the meatpacking industry. A couple of the things that end up getting passed were the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And this said that meatpacking facilities had to be inspected. So now you had inspectors going in to make sure that they were cleanly, that wrong things weren't being put into meat, that there were certain standards that the factories were having to uphold. Another thing that got passed was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1806. And this stated now when things were sold at the supermarket, there needed to be a label on it that told specifically what was put into that particular food product. And it had to be labeled honestly. You all know if you go to the grocery store with your parents nowadays, you may see the list of ingredients on the side of a box or the percentages of what is in with the piece of food. That goes all the way back to this time period with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1806. And it comes from women generally who were wanting to make sure that they were feeding what was good for to their families. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is something called prohibition. These here are kegs of beer, and you can see that the kegs of beer were being spilled out during this time period. So what happens during the Progressive Era, you have something passed called the 18th Amendment. And under the 18th Amendment, it is made illegal to make, sell, or to consume any sort of alcoholic beverages in the United States. And in this particular case, you see that beer is being thrown out. And that happens because there was a movement called the temperance movement. And the temperance movement basically said that the problems of society come from alcohol. And if you get rid of alcohol, it'll help to get rid of problems in society. It was led not only by women, but primarily women, in the fact that they were upset that there was being domestic abuse that was happening. They claimed that their husbands would go out to the bars and drink at night and come home and hit them, initiate domestic violence because they were drunk. They claimed that their husbands were spending all of their money in the local bars instead of coming home and supporting their families. So through these actions, it actually goes forth and it becomes an amendment to the Constitution in which it makes alcohol illegal. Now we know eventually that it gets overturned because it is not still illegal now in the United States. Another issue that we're going to be talking about as we move through this unit is women's rights, particularly on two different fronts. Now, we're talking about the early to mid 1900s, okay? Women still have not gotten the right to vote as of this point. Women were also still seen as lesser of men. So this picture here, it's got ladies tailor strikers. And what they are protesting is this idea that women should be allowed to make the same amount of money as men for the work. It was not unusual during this time that women made considerably less than men. Women were considered less than men, and as such, they needed to be paid less. So women actually went on strikes, particularly in the northern factories, and picketed and revolted in order to gain the same wages and equal wages as men during this time. Another thing that we will see happen during this time period is the passage of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. Remember, we have talked previously this year, women were not granted the right to vote. We had African American men that had been granted the right to vote under our last unit. But women still during this time, didn't matter what color they were not allowed to vote. And it's not until the passage of the 19th Amendment that this becomes passed. This here is an opposition. It says opposed to women's suffrage. Anytime you see the word suffrage, you're going to think right to vote. Okay. So this, you see a whole bunch of men sitting here and they're signing documents that are saying they don't think women should have the right to vote. You'll notice that what strikes me as funny in this picture, you see this woman here and she is looking at them like, really, guys, come on. We should be able to have the same rights and freedoms as men do as well. Now what you need to do as you go through, and as we just talked about, I spoke about each of the slides, I want you to go back through and create a hashtag for each of the pictures that would show and to demonstrate your knowledge base of each of the pictures. And then you need to go back all the way back to the very first question. Sorry, let's see if I can get here. The very first question, why was reform necessary in the earliest 20th century? Remember, you are then going to also write a paragraph that explains this based upon the knowledge of your slides. Miss y'all, do a good job. Talk to you soon.